I know, doctor, but I saw my baby in that ultrasound just 2 weeks ago. And she's not there anymore. Yes, Mom? Okay, Grandma's passed. Okay. All right, I'll get over there now. What? My cousin committed suicide? Oh my gosh. We've all experienced something like this. Change the name, change the loss, but we've all experienced loss in our life. I'm going to specifically speak on the mode of loss being death, but we can also lose security, loss of security, loss of dreams. There's other losses that we all will experience in life. It will not happen. We all experience loss. So, as you've seen what I've talked about, thinking about, your own experiences as I talk. So what I wanted to talk about in the next few minutes is going over grief in itself, just in general, but also I have a feeling, it feels like suicide is the worst type of grief. That was my intuition. So I started looking into it to see, okay, is there different forms of grief or worse types of grief? So in 2017 in the US, death by suicide ranked number 10. That was last year. In 15 to 24-year-olds, it ranked number 2. So we have a suicide issue. So what does and how does a person experience grief? Why is grief over a suicide loss so difficult? And what kind of help is effective for a loss survivor? That's what I'd like to go over in the next few minutes. So what and how do we experience grief? We know about 5 stages by Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. We also know now about the 4 tasks of grief. And basically these are 2 frameworks for healing, to try and get your life back to equilibrium after you've experienced grief. And then I also wanted to go over complicated grief, which is also similar, I guess, to, but not the same as prolonged grief disorder, which is new, and I had not known about that disorder, but learned about that as I was researching. So the 5 stages you'll see here are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and that was Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's model. She worked closely with a man named David Kessler, and they co-authored on Grief and Grieving, which is the first picture on the slide of the book. The second book is Finding Meaning, and that is David Kessler's book on what he has discovered to be the 6th stage of grieving, and it is Finding Meaning. So that is one framework. The bottom line on this framework is that it is explaining what you experience when you grieve, and not everybody experiences the same thing, and not everybody goes through all 6 stages even, and they aren't in order. There's no order to them. The 4 tasks of grief, again, is a different framework, and William Warder created it because he felt like Kübler-Ross's framework explained what you experience when grieving, but how do you experience grieving? So he came up with the 4 tasks. First task is we're accepting the reality of the loss. Second is we're experiencing the pain of grief. Third is we're adjusting to an environment in which the deceased is missing. And the 4th task is finding an enduring connection with the deceased and move on with life. These happen in somewhat of an order, but again, every grief is different because every death is different. So with something like suicide, or your mother dying or your husband dying, where it's very close, complicated grief can occur. but especially if there are feelings of guilt or confusion along with over the loss. Complicated grief can set in. Now, that's different, it's not a disorder, that's just something that we see in people who are grieving. But prolonged grief disorder is an actual disorder. And the core symptoms of it is a longing for and preoccupation with the deceased, emotional distress, significant functional impairment, in other words, you can't do anything, can't get out of the house. Symptoms persist beyond 6 months after the loss, then the possibility is that this person is experiencing PGD. And why I wanted to talk about that is so we can watch for that in our friends and in ourselves, because again, we all experience loss. So the health consequences associated with PGD are I think, kind of serious. We have elevated rates of suicidal ideation and attempts. Cancer, immunological dysfunction, hypertension, cardiac events, functional impairment, adverse health behavior. That could be like, a person who is normally not risky starts taking risks. Reduced quality of life in adults and in the children that are in the life of the adult that might be experiencing it. Increased health service use and sick leave is also a sign. So according to a report by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the suicide rates for adults in the U.S. are on the rise. Since '99, we've had 25 states, it's increased by more than 30%. In the U.S., suicide accounted for nearly 45,000 deaths in 2016 and 47,000 deaths in 2017. If there is an average of one person every 1.1 minutes who kills themselves, and among those exposed to a death by suicide, more than 6 people experience a major life disruption, then there are technically an average of 6 new loss survivors every 11.1 minutes. So why is grief over a suicide loss so difficult? Well, my intuition was correct. I don't know if it's worse necessarily, but it is particularly difficult. According to John R. McIntosh and John R. Jordan, who are big names in suicidology, survivors of suicide loss experience high levels of distress for a considerable length of time after exposure, including but not limited to PTSD. I didn't know that. But you can experience post-traumatic stress disorder after experiencing a suicide. You might not have had to find the person, or actually seen it or even really known them that well, but those images can just pop into your head. And if they do that and you can't control them and you're just always focused on them, that can be kind of a sign of PTSD. Also, confusion of feelings. In homicide, you can be angry at the perpetrator, but in suicide, you don't know who to be angry at because the suicide victim is also the perpetrator. And also, you can overestimate your contributing role and the fact that you couldn't change something, the result from happening, which is also self-punishing. So the kind of help that's effective for a loss survivor is group therapy, internet support groups, individual therapy, and friendship. Group therapy, especially with other suicide loss survivors. Internet support groups are actually gaining in popularity because there's 24/7 availability, and there's usually a stigma attached to a suicide, and so that person can grieve with others, but yet by themselves. Also, the hopeful thing is that most suicide loss survivors know that they need to seek medical help or mental professional help, and more so than any other bereaved person. So seeking individual therapy is also really important to a suicide loss survivor. And then friendship. As a suicide loss survivor myself and a friend of several suicide loss survivors, I can tell you that friendship is the most important part. Somebody who's willing to talk to you about it. Remember, grief is not something that happens to you, it is a state of being. Use the stages or tasks framework to restore your life equilibrium And watch out for PGD in you or anyone you know experiencing loss. Suicide loss can be a difficult form of bereavement where help and support is most likely needed, so please reach out. And remember, if you're in doubt at all about what to do, remember what the 4 tops said. Now, if you feel that you can't go on because all of your hope is gone and your life is filled with much confusion until happiness is just an illusion and your world around is crumbling down, honey, I'll be there with a love that will shelter you. I'll be there with a love that will see you through. Thank you.